10 days, no water resupply, no radio contact, no extraction plan, and 12 men who came back looking like they had crawled straight out of hell itself. When American Special Forces saw those battered Land Rovers roll into base in 2008, they thought they were looking at ghosts, wild beards matted with Afghan dust, uniforms so torn they looked like rags, and eyes, those hollow 1,000-yard stares that made even hardened Delta operators step back. These were the Australian SAS, the men the Taliban called the bearded ones. The operators they feared more than American airstrikes, more than drones, more than anything the coalition could throw at them. But here is what nobody talks about. How did 12 men survive 240 kilometers inside enemy territory with just 3 liters of water per day? How did they eliminate 17 high-value targets without a single shot being traced back to them? And what did they sacrifice? What did they become to pull off missions that American commanders called impossible? The SEALs who rode with them came back changed. Their classified reports have never been released. The techniques they witnessed rewrote the entire playbook for special operations. And the darkness those Australian operators carried, it would eventually explode into one of the most shocking military scandals in modern history. Stay with me to the end, because what you are about to hear is the untold story of the Red Desert, the missions that were never supposed to exist, and the warriors who became something that even their own country struggles to explain. This is the truth about how Australia built the most feared special operations force of the Afghan war, and the terrible price they paid for it. The American Special Forces captain had seen plenty of hard men in his 12 years of service. He had trained with Delta at Fort Bragg, conducted joint exercises with British SBS in Poole, and once spent 3 weeks embedded with German KSK in the Bavarian Alps. But nothing prepared him for what he witnessed on that scorching August morning in 2008 when a convoy of battered Land Rovers rolled into Forward Operating Base Anaconda after 10 days of complete radio silence in the most hostile terrain Afghanistan had to offer. When the vehicles looked like they had driven straight out of a post-apocalyptic nightmare. Dust caked every surface so thick that the original paint color was impossible to determine. The windshields were cracked and starred from shrapnel impacts. Mounted 50-caliber machine guns sat at odd angles, their barrels still warm despite the hour-long drive back to base. And the men climbing out of those wrecks were something else entirely. 12 Australian SASR operators dismounted from those 3 vehicles, and not a single one of them looked like they belonged to any military force the captain recognized. Their beards had grown wild and matted with Afghan dust. Their uniforms were so faded and torn they might as well have been wearing civilian rags. Several had abandoned their standard-issue boots entirely, wrapping their feet in local cloth the way mountain tribesmen did. The smell hit the Americans from 20 meters away, a rancid combination of unwashed human bodies, diesel fuel, animal fat, and something else that nobody wanted to identify. But the real shock was yet to come. Every single one of those Australians had the same hollow 1,000-yard stare. They moved with mechanical precision, unloading equipment and checking weapons with motions so practiced they appeared almost robotic. Not one of them spoke above a whisper. Not one of them smiled or showed any emotion whatsoever. The captain would later write in his classified after-action report that he felt like he was watching ghosts return from the underworld. Those 12 men had just completed one of the most audacious long-range reconnaissance patrols in the entire global war on terror. They had infiltrated 240 kilometers into Taliban-controlled territory. They had survived on 3 liters of water per man per day in temperatures exceeding 50 degrees Celsius. They had eliminated 17 high-value targets without firing a single shot that could be traced back to coalition forces, and they had done it all without a single resupply, without air support, and without any communication with their chain of command for 10 straight days. This was not the war the Americans knew. This was something far older and infinitely more terrifying. And the story of how they got there would change everything the captain thought he understood about special operations. The road that led those 12 Australians into the Red Desert had been paved with blood and frustration years before that August morning. Operation Enduring Freedom had begun in October of 2001 with overwhelming force that Americans had perfected since the first Gulf War. Stealth bombers pulverized Taliban positions from 40,000 feet. A C-130 Spectre gunships turned mountain hideouts into craters. Navy SEALs and Delta Force operators fast roped from Black Hawks into compounds that had already been softened by precision-guided munitions. For the first 2 years, it seemed to work brilliantly. The Taliban scattered, al-Qaeda fled to Pakistan, the Afghan people welcomed their liberators. Then the enemy adapted. By 2005, Taliban commanders had studied American tactics with the same dedication that military academies studied Clausewitz. They knew that U.S. forces relied heavily on helicopters for insertion and extraction. They knew that American rules of engagement required positive identification before weapons could be fired. They knew that coalition patrols never strayed more than a few hours from their forward operating bases because the logistics chain demanded regular resupply. Most importantly, they knew that Americans were predictable. The pattern was always identical. Intelligence would identify a high-value target in a particular village. A mission would be planned at the company or battalion level. Helicopters would lift off from Bagram or Kandahar in the early morning hours. The assault force would hit the target compound with overwhelming firepower, and then within 48 to 72 hours, those same helicopters would extract the operators back to safety, and the Taliban called this pattern the American clock. Whenever coalition helicopters were spotted approaching a target area, the local Taliban commander would simply melt into the civilian population. He would shave his beard, put on farmer clothing, and spend the next 3 days working in the fields alongside actual villagers. The Americans would search the compound, find nothing, and eventually leave. Within a week, that same commander would be back to planning attacks on coalition convoys. But someone was about to propose a radical solution. The frustration reached a boiling point during a joint planning session at Kandahar Airfield in early 2006. American, British, Canadian, and Australian Special Operations commanders had gathered to discuss the deteriorating security situation in the southern provinces. The discussion quickly devolved into finger-pointing about whose national caveats were hampering the mission most severely. An Australian lieutenant colonel stood up and asked a question that silenced the room. Why are we fighting their war instead of ours? The American colonel chairing the meeting frowned and asked for clarification. The Australian obliged with the bluntness his nation was famous for. Every time we launch a helicopter assault, we announce ourselves from 50 kilometers away. Every time we establish a patrol base, we create a static target the enemy can observe and avoid. Every time we follow the same routes and the same timelines, we hand the Taliban a playbook they can use to predict our every move. He paused and scanned the room full of uncomfortable faces. We have the best trained special operations forces in the world, and we are using them like conventional infantry with better equipment. My country sent us here to find and eliminate the people who plan attacks on coalition forces and innocent civilians. We did not come here to conduct security theater for the benefit of Pentagon briefing slides. What he proposed next would have seemed like madness to anyone unfamiliar with Australian military history. The concept was called persistent presence operations, but the troops themselves used a simpler name, living in the dirt. Instead of flying into an area, conducting a raid, and flying out, SASR patrols would infiltrate on the ground using vehicles that could blend into the Afghan landscape. They would establish covert observation positions in areas no coalition force had ever operated before. They would remain in place for days or weeks at a time, gathering intelligence through patient surveillance rather than aggressive questioning, and when targets presented themselves, they would be eliminated with such precision that the Taliban would never know what had hit them. The Americans were skeptical. The logistics alone seemed impossible. How could a patrol survive for 10 or 14 days without resupply in terrain where temperatures routinely exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit? How could they maintain operational security when any local farmer might spot them? How could they possibly extract if something went wrong? The Australian smiled grimly. We will not need resupply because we will carry everything we need from the start. We will not be spotted because we will look and smell exactly like the environment around us. And we will not need emergency extraction because we will not put ourselves in positions where extraction becomes necessary. It sounded like a suicide mission dressed up in tactical jargon, but the Australians had already proven the concept worked. 3 patrols had been conducted in the previous 4 months, each lasting between 7 and 12 days. Combined, those patrols had produced more actionable intelligence than the entire Kandahar-based task force had generated in the previous quarter, and they had done it without a single Australian casualty, without a single compromise, and without any indication that the Taliban even knew they were there. The American colonel asked to see the after-action reports. The Australian declined politely. Those documents were classified at the highest levels of the Australian government and could not be shared with foreign partners regardless of alliance status. This told the Americans everything they needed to know about how seriously Canberra was taking this new approach, and it made them desperate to see it for themselves. The first Americans to witness SASR persistent presence operations firsthand were a 6-man SEAL reconnaissance team assigned to support Australian operations in Uruzgan province during the summer of 2007. They had been told they would be accompanying an Australian patrol on a relatively short mission to observe suspected Taliban logistics routes through a remote valley. What they experienced over the following 9 days would fundamentally alter their understanding of what special operations could achieve. The mission began at 0300 hours with a vehicle movement from a small Australian patrol base northeast of Tarin Kowt. The SEALs had expected to use their standard MRAPs, mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles that weighed over 14,000 kilograms and could survive direct hits from most improvised explosive devices. Instead, they found themselves assigned to ride in Australian long-range patrol vehicles that the operators affectionately called pigs. These were not vehicles in any sense the Americans recognized. They were essentially open-top Land Rover frames with every non-essential component stripped away to save weight. The doors had been removed entirely. The windshields had been folded down flat against the hoods. The roofs were nothing more than lightweight roll cages that would provide zero protection from enemy fire or the brutal Afghan sun. The SEAL team leader felt his stomach drop. What the vehicles lacked in armor, they made up for in firepower and mobility. Each pig mounted a .50 caliber heavy machine gun on the passenger side and an Mk-19 automatic grenade launcher on a rear pintle mount. Additional weapons were strapped to every available surface. Ammunition boxes were stacked so high they formed makeshift barriers around the passenger compartments. The SEAL team leader asked the Australian patrol commander where the rest of the convoy was. Surely more vehicles would be joining them for a 9-day patrol into hostile territory. The Australian laughed. More vehicles meant more signatures, more fuel requirements, more maintenance problems, and more chances for compromise. They would be operating with 3 pigs, 12 Australians, 6 Americans, and absolutely nothing else. The convoy departed into the darkness, and the education began. The first lesson came within 3 hours. The convoy had been following a route that paralleled a known Taliban supply corridor when the lead Australian driver suddenly killed his engine and coasted to a stop without any verbal or radio communication. The other 2 vehicles did exactly the same thing within seconds, their drivers somehow knowing to halt despite no apparent signal being given. The SEALs sat in confused silence, hands on weapons, scanning for threats they could not see. The Australians dismounted without a word and began camouflaging the vehicles using pre-positioned netting and local vegetation they had gathered during a previous patrol. Within 15 minutes, the 3 pigs had effectively disappeared into the landscape. Only then did the patrol commander approach the SEAL team leader and explain in whispers so quiet they were barely audible. A local shepherd had been spotted approximately 3 kilometers to the east, moving his flock toward a watering point that would give him a clear line of sight to the convoy route. The Australian point man had detected the movement through his scope and signaled the halt using a prearranged hand gesture that the following drivers had observed in their mirrors. Now the patrol would remain stationary for approximately 2 hours until the shepherd completed his watering and moved on. The SEAL asked why they could not simply continue on a different route. The Australian shook his head slowly. Changing routes would create new vehicle tracks and terrain where tracks lasted for weeks. Those tracks would be spotted by other locals, reported to Taliban observers, and eventually used to pattern coalition movements. Better to wait, remain invisible, and leave no trace. This was the first principle of persistent presence operations. Every action had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation, but this was merely the introduction. The convoy resumed movement after nightfall and covered another 60 kilometers before establishing their first observation position just before dawn. The location had been selected weeks in advance using satellite imagery and confirmed through human intelligence sources. It was a shallow depression on a ridge overlooking 2 valleys, invisible from below but providing perfect sight lines to a village suspected of harboring a Taliban logistics coordinator. The SEALs expected to set up a standard observation post with camouflage netting, fighting positions, and communication equipment. What they witnessed instead bordered on the primitive. The Australians did not set up fighting positions, they became the landscape. Each operator selected a spot that matched his body dimensions and began scraping out a shallow trench using nothing but his hands and a small folding shovel. The excavated dirt was not piled beside the trench, but distributed in thin layers across the surrounding area to match the existing ground color. The trenches were lined with local rocks and vegetation until they looked like natural features of the terrain. When an Australian climbed into his hide, he effectively ceased to exist. The SEALs attempted to replicate this technique with limited success. Their training had emphasized speed and efficiency in establishing positions, not the painstaking artistry the Australians demonstrated. By the time full daylight arrived, the American positions were noticeably inferior, visible irregularities in an otherwise uniform landscape. The Australian patrol commander crawled over to inspect and made a decision that illustrated the ruthless practicality of persistent presence doctrine. The Americans would not be conducting any observation duties during daylight hours. Their positions were inadequate, and any movement to improve them would compromise the entire patrol. They would remain absolutely still in their flawed hides until darkness returned. For the next 14 hours, the 6 SEALs lay motionless in the brutal Afghan heat while the Australians conducted continuous surveillance. Water was rationed to small sips taken through tube systems that required no hand movement. Bodily functions were handled through specialized devices that eliminated the need to change position. Food consisted of pre-opened ration packets consumed without visible motion. By the time darkness finally returned, the SEAL team leader had developed profound respect for the discipline required to operate this way, and he had serious questions about whether his own men could sustain it. Those questions were about to be answered in the most brutal way possible. Day 3 brought the first real test. Intelligence had indicated that a meeting would take place in the target village between the suspected logistics coordinator and 2 visiting commanders from a neighboring province. The Australians intended to observe and document this meeting, identify all participants through photographic evidence, and track their departure routes for future targeting. The SEALs had a different perspective. In their experience, such meetings represented prime opportunities for direct action. A well-placed drone strike or a rapid helicopter assault could eliminate 3 high-value targets simultaneously. Waiting and watching seemed like a waste of a golden opportunity. The Australian patrol commander listened patiently, then explained why direct action was precisely the wrong approach. Destroying these 3 men would accomplish nothing of lasting value. They would be replaced within days by other commanders who would simply avoid meeting in the same location. The strike would reveal that coalition forces had penetrated the valley, eliminating any possibility of future operations in the area, and the collateral damage would generate exactly the kind of grievances that fueled the insurgency. But if they watched and waited, something far more valuable could be achieved. The meeting would reveal relationships between Taliban cells that currently appeared unconnected. The departure routes would expose safe houses, weapons caches, and communication nodes that no amount of signals intelligence could identify. 1 week of patience now could save months of frustration later. The SEAL processed this logic and found himself unable to argue against it. The meeting took place exactly as intelligence had predicted. From their concealed positions, the Australians photographed every participant using long-range cameras that could capture facial features from over a kilometer away. They recorded the duration of the meeting, the body language of the participants, and the subtle hierarchies revealed by who spoke first and who deferred to whom. When the meeting concluded and the visitors departed, the Australians tracked their routes using a combination of direct observation and previously in place sensors that the SEALs had not even known existed. Within 4 hours, 3 new safe house locations had been identified, 2 previously unknown vehicle caches had been plotted, and the communications pattern between the logistics coordinator and his superiors had been partially mapped, all accomplished without firing a single shot. Yet the most critical lesson was still ahead. Day 5 brought a crisis that would test everything the patrol had learned and reveal the true difference between American and Australian approaches under pressure. The observation position had been compromised. A young goatherd, no more than 12 or 13 years old, had wandered into the patrol perimeter while searching for a stray animal. He stumbled directly over one of the American positions, locking eyes with the SEAL buried in the shallow trench below him. For a moment that stretched into eternity, the 2 stared at each other. The boy's face registered first confusion, then recognition, then pure terror. His mouth opened as if to scream. The SEAL's training took over. His hand moved toward his suppressed sidearm. One shot would eliminate the threat and preserve operational security. It was the logical solution. But before his weapon cleared the holster, an Australian appeared beside the boy as if materializing from the earth itself. The operator was speaking quietly in Pashto, a language the SEALs had not known any of the Australians possessed, using a tone that somehow combined authority, reassurance, and warning in equal measure. What happened next would be seared into the SEAL team leader's memory for the rest of his career. The Australian guided the terrified boy to a seated position, maintaining constant, gentle contact while speaking in the same quiet tone. Within 30 seconds, the boy's breathing had slowed. Within a minute, his expression had shifted from terror to something approaching curiosity. The conversation that followed lasted nearly 15 minutes. The Australian asked about the boy's family, his village, his goats. He inquired about the boy's health and whether his family had enough food for the winter. He expressed sympathy for the difficulties of life in the valley. Throughout this conversation, the Australian made no threats and offered no bribes. He never once mentioned the military, the Taliban, or the reason for his presence. He simply talked to the boy as one human being to another. When the conversation ended, the Australian handed the boy a small package of candy that he had apparently been carrying for exactly this contingency. He explained that the boy would need to leave now and should not return to this area for the next few days. He suggested that the boy might want to keep this encounter to himself. The boy nodded solemnly, accepted the candy, and departed without looking back. The SEAL team leader waited until the boy was well out of earshot before confronting the Australian. How could he possibly trust that the boy would keep silent? The Australian's response cut to the heart of everything that separated their two approaches. That boy will not report us because we gave him nothing to report. He saw travelers, not soldiers. He experienced kindness, not violence. If he tells his family what happened, they will think he imagined it or made up a story. And even if he wanted to report our position to the Taliban, what would he say? The Australian paused and let that sink in. But if we had eliminated him, his family would know within hours that he was missing. Search parties would be organized. His body would eventually be found, and the entire valley would know that foreign soldiers were willing to execute children to preserve their secrecy. That knowledge would generate more Taliban recruits than 100 propaganda videos. The SEAL had no response. His training had prepared him to neutralize threats. It had not prepared him to see a terrified child as an opportunity for connection rather than a problem to be solved. The patrol continued without incident. The boy never returned, and no Taliban forces converged on their position. But a fundamental shift had occurred in how the Americans understood counterinsurgency warfare, and the lessons kept coming. The remaining days revealed layer upon layer of doctrine the Australians had developed through years of brutal experience. The water discipline was not merely about physical survival. The Australians consumed approximately 3 liters per day in temperatures that should have required 6 or 7 minimum. They achieved this through strict movement schedules, shade management, and dietary modifications that reduced hydration requirements. But the deeper purpose was operational. Every liter of water carried added weight that reduced mobility and increased detection probability. A patrol that needed resupply had to coordinate helicopter flights and ground movements that create exactly the kind of signatures allowing Taliban forces to pattern coalition activities. By eliminating resupply requirements, the Australians eliminated the vulnerabilities that came with them. The same logic applied to food, ammunition, and every other consumable resource. The Australians carried enough to complete their mission plus a 30% reserve for contingencies, nothing more. The Americans found this approach claustrophobic. Their training emphasized having more than enough of everything with robust supply lines ready to provide additional resources, but the Australians saw it differently. Abundance created dependency, and dependency created vulnerability. A patrol that could not survive without external support was a patrol that could be defeated simply by disrupting that support. A patrol that needed nothing from the outside world was effectively immune to anything except direct confrontation, and the Australians went to extraordinary lengths to ensure direct confrontation never occurred. The vehicle maintenance philosophy reflected the same independence. The pigs carried minimal spare parts, but every operator was trained to perform field repairs using local materials and improvisation. During the mission, one vehicle developed a fuel line leak that would have grounded any American vehicle pending proper repair. The Australians fixed it using cloth bandaging, wire ties, and what appeared to be animal intestine harvested from a carcass they found beside the road. The repair was ugly and smelled terrible, but it worked. And the patrol continued without losing a vehicle or requesting support. This improvisational capability extended to weapons, communications equipment, and even medical procedures. The Australian medic demonstrated a wound closure technique using thorns and plant fibers that he claimed had been taught to him by an Aboriginal elder during survival training in the Northern Territory. Whether this was true or simply a colorful story, the technique was undeniably effective, but the most significant difference was philosophical rather than technical. The Americans measured success in kinetic terms. Targets eliminated, compounds raided, caches destroyed. These metrics could be counted, reported, and briefed to senior commanders who needed evidence that operations were producing results. The Australians rejected this framework entirely. They measured success in terms of intelligence gathered, networks mapped. and future opportunities created. A patrol that returned without firing a single shot, but with detailed information about enemy command structures, was considered far more successful than a patrol that eliminated a dozen insurgents, but revealed coalition capabilities in the process. This explained why the Australians could justify spending 9 days observing a single village while American commanders would have been demanding action within the first 48 hours. The Australians were playing a different game, one measured in months and years rather than days and weeks, and their results spoke for themselves. Yet the true test was still approaching. Day 8 brought the culmination of everything the patrol had worked toward, the moment when patient observation transformed into decisive action with surgical precision. The intelligence gathered over the previous week had revealed a pattern that no amount of signals, intercepts, or drone surveillance could have detected. The Taliban logistics coordinator was not simply organizing supply movements for local insurgent cells. He was running a covert courier network that connected senior commanders across 3 provinces, facilitating communications that bypassed every electronic monitoring system coalition forces had deployed. The network operated on a brilliantly simple principle. Messages were never written down or transmitted electronically. Instead, they were memorized by couriers who traveled openly along normal commercial routes, appearing to be nothing more than farmers or merchants going about their daily business. The messages were passed verbally at predetermined locations: a tea house in one village, a market stall in another, a mosque in a third, with no physical evidence ever created. This explained why coalition electronic warfare units had been unable to penetrate Taliban command communications despite deploying the most advanced signals intelligence technology in the world. The enemy had simply opted out of the electronic domain entirely. Now the Australians had mapped the network. They knew the identity of 7 couriers, the locations of 12 message transfer points, and the schedule governing when communications occurred. They had even identified the commander who served as the ultimate recipient, a senior Taliban leader whose location had eluded coalition forces for nearly 2 years. The question was what to do with this information. The American approach would have been straightforward: call in strikes on the identified locations, capture or eliminate the couriers, roll up the network in simultaneous raids that would produce impressive statistics. The Australian patrol commander had a different idea. Rather than destroying the network, he proposed that coalition forces allow it to continue operating under their surveillance. The courier identities would be shared with intelligence agencies who would track their movements across the entire Afghan theater. The transfer points would be monitored to identify additional participants, and the communications themselves would be observed, providing insight into Taliban strategic thinking that no interrogation could produce. Destroying the network would eliminate a threat. Exploiting the network would provide a window into enemy operations for months or years. The proposal was transmitted through the patrol's first communication since departing the forward operating base 8 days earlier. The Australian used a burst transmission system that compressed the message into a fraction of a second, making interception virtually impossible. The response came within 6 hours. The network would be left intact. Monitoring operations would begin immediately, and the patrol was authorized to conduct one direct action mission before extracting: the elimination of the logistics coordinator himself. And this was not contradiction but complementary strategy. Removing the coordinator would disrupt the network temporarily while intelligence agencies established monitoring capabilities. By the time the Taliban appointed a replacement, coalition forces would be watching every message. Day 9 would determine whether this approach was justified, and the method would shock even the Americans who thought they had seen everything. The elimination of the logistics coordinator exemplified everything that made Australian special operations different and everything that made them so effective in the Afghan environment. There would be no helicopter assault, no precision-guided munitions, no explosive breach charges or flashbang grenades. The coordinator would simply cease to exist, and no one would ever know exactly what had happened. The operation began at 200 hours, 6 hours before the coordinator was scheduled to depart for a meeting in a neighboring village. The Australian sniper team had established a position overlooking the target compound 3 days earlier. They had observed the coordinator's routine, identified his sleeping quarters, mapped security arrangements, and calculated firing solutions from multiple angles. The shot would be taken using the suppressed AWM chambered in .338 Lapua Magnum, a weapon capable of lethal accuracy at ranges exceeding 1,500 meters with a sound signature nearly impossible to locate. The sniper had been waiting in position for over 16 hours, motionless, except for subtle adjustments required to maintain blood flow and muscle readiness. His spotter provided continuous observations through a high-powered scope, tracking guard movements, door activity, and the flickering of lights indicating human activity within the compound. At 02:47 hours, the coordinator emerged from his quarters to use the latrine. He was alone, backlit by a kerosene lamp that provided perfect silhouette targeting and stationary for the 8 to 12 seconds required. The sniper exhaled slowly, settled the crosshairs on center mass, and pressed the trigger with the smooth motion of a man who had performed this action thousands of times. The AWM coughed once, a sound no louder than a heavy book falling on a wooden floor. 800 meters away, the logistics coordinator crumpled without a sound. The sniper team remained in position for another 40 minutes, observing the compound for any indication that the shot had been detected. There was none. The guards continued their patrols, oblivious to the fact that their commander would never wake up. Only when they were certain no alarm had been raised did the Australians begin extraction. They moved with the same patience and precision that had characterized the entire mission, covering 20 kilometers before dawn and another 60 the following night. The 3 pigs rolled into forward operating base Anaconda on the morning of day 10. 12 Australians and 6 Americans had been fundamentally transformed by what they had witnessed. The SEALs would file their own after-action reports through American channels. Those reports would be classified at levels ensuring only a handful of senior officers would ever read them, but the lessons learned would spread through informal networks, conversations in ready rooms, observations shared during training exercises, techniques adopted by operators who recognized superior methods. Within 18 months, American Special Operations units began experimenting with extended patrol durations. Within 3 years, modified vehicle configurations resembling Australian pigs appeared in certain American formations, and the philosophical shift from kinetic metrics to intelligence gathering, from shock and awe to patient persistence, gradually transformed how the entire coalition approached counterinsurgency operations. The Australians had not just completed a mission. They had demonstrated a different way of war, but the cost of that way was heavier than anyone watching from the outside could comprehend. The darkness that the American captain sensed in those hollow-eyed operators was not imaginary. It was the accumulated weight of what persistent presence operations demanded from the men who conducted them. By 2008, some Australian SASR operators had completed 10 or more rotations to Afghanistan. They had spent years living in conditions that would have been familiar to their grandfathers who fought in the jungles of New Guinea during the Second World War. Filthy, exhausted, constantly alert, operating far beyond any support system. Each rotation stripped away another layer of the psychological armor that allows warriors to function in normal society. The patience required to lie motionless in a hide for 18 hours became an inability to tolerate the chaos of ordinary civilian life. The hypervigilance that kept them alive in hostile terrain became an inability to relax even in the safety of their own homes. The moral clarity of combat became a disturbing inability to accept the ambiguity of a world where such simple solutions were not available. And then there was the darker truth that no official report would acknowledge. The catch and release cycle had driven some operators to the edge. They would spend weeks tracking a Taliban commander, gathering evidence of his involvement in attacks that had cost coalition and Afghan lives, only to watch that same commander walk free because the legal system could not process the intelligence they had gathered. The targets they were forbidden to engage would resurface months later, leading new attacks that took new lives. Some operators stopped taking prisoners entirely. The official explanation was that operational conditions did not permit detention and that targets were eliminated because capture was tactically impossible. But the Americans who worked alongside Australian units noticed that tactical impossibility seemed to occur with remarkable frequency when high-value targets were involved. Whether this represented justice or something far darker depended entirely on perspective, and on whether the observer believed that the rules of warfare could meaningfully apply to an enemy who recognized no rules at all. The Australian government would eventually be forced to confront these questions through a public inquiry that exposed conduct shocking even to hardened military observers. The Brereton Report, released in 2020, documented unlawful actions, cover-ups, and systematic violations of the laws of armed conflict by elements of the Australian Special Operations community. But that reckoning lay years in the future. In 2008, the only thing visible was effectiveness. Australian SASR patrols were producing intelligence that shaped coalition strategy. Their targeted operations were removing Taliban commanders faster than the insurgency could replace them, and their methods, however unconventional, however uncomfortable, were demonstrably working. The American captain who watched those operators dismount could not have known the full scope of what he was witnessing. He saw only the external manifestations, the wild beards, the feral appearance, the thousand-yard stares that spoke of experiences no briefing could convey. But he understood instinctively that these men had crossed lines that most warriors would never approach. They had sacrificed something fundamental to become the instruments their mission required, and whether that sacrifice was noble or tragic or simply inevitable in the kind of war they were fighting, he could not say. What he could say, what he would say in debriefs and training sessions for years afterward, was that the Australians had shown him a different kind of special operations. Not better or worse than the American way, but fundamentally different in its assumptions about what warriors could endure and what they might become in the process. The Taliban called them the bearded ones and feared them more than airstrikes. Coalition commanders called them force multipliers and marveled at their effectiveness. The operators themselves rarely called themselves anything at all. They simply did the job, rotation after rotation, until the job consumed whatever parts of them had once been separate from it. Water is a luxury was how one Australian had explained the persistent presence philosophy to the Americans. Everything is a luxury except the mission. In the end, that equation consumed more than just water. It consumed men, careers, and the distinction between warrior and weapon that allows soldiers to return to civilian life. But it won the war, or at least the version of the war that could be won in the valleys and mountains where these operations took place. The larger questions about strategic success, about nation building, about whether any victory was possible in Afghanistan would take another decade to answer, and those answers would not be kind to anyone who had invested blood and treasure in the effort. What remained was the legend, the bearded ones who appeared from the desert like ghosts, who watched and waited with inhuman patience, who struck with precision that left no trace. The warriors who drove into ambushes while Americans dove for cover, the mountain phantoms who rose from the dirt beside seals who had thought themselves alone. These stories would be told and retold, embellished and exaggerated, until reality became impossible to separate from mythology. Future generations of special operators from a dozen nations would hear about the SASR in Afghanistan and wonder what manner of men could accomplish such things. The answer was simple and terrible. They were ordinary men forged into something extraordinary by the demands of a war that offered no other path to victory. They paid prices that no training could prepare them for and no peacetime society could compensate, and they became, for a brief moment in a forgotten war, the most effective counterinsurgency force the world had ever seen. Whether that was worth celebrating or mourning depended on questions that have no easy answers. What was certain was that when the dust settled and the vehicles were cleaned and the beards were eventually trimmed, those men carried something with them that would never fully heal. The hollow stare the American captain observed was not temporary fatigue. It was the permanent mark of having looked into the abyss of what human beings are capable of and having chosen to live there because the mission demanded nothing less. The Red Desert had taken its toll. It always did. But for 10 days in the summer of 2008, 12 Australian operators and 6 American SEALs had proven that coalition forces could operate anywhere, survive anything, and accomplish what conventional wisdom declared impossible. That knowledge changed everything, and the men who earned it would never be the same again.